What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
During that Sunday barbecue, when the smoke from the grill curled lazily into the sky and the neighbors' kids were chasing each other in the yard, my parents raised their glasses with broad smiles and announced, almost ceremoniously, how proud they were of my sister. They clinked their cups with a loud cheer, voices bright with pride, while she laughed and blushed as if she had just won an award. I stood only a few steps away, setting down a bowl of salad no one had bothered to touch, and for a brief second, I wondered if anyone at the table would even notice if I vanished into the hedges behind the fence. Not a single pair of eyes turned toward me, not a word of acknowledgement escaped their lips, and in that moment it was as though I were some part-time caterer hired to keep the drinks cold and the plates full. I could feel my chest tighten, not because I hadn't grown used to this routine, but because every single time it happened, it reminded me how effortlessly they managed to erase me from the picture. I forced myself to keep moving, gathering empty plates stacked with half-chewed ribs and soggy buns, and as I carried them inside, the sound of my father's booming laugh echoed across the patio. He slapped my sister's fiancé on the back as though he were already blood, as though he were the chosen one who had secured the future of the family. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window while scraping the plates, and the smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth wasn't sadness or defeat, it was recognition of a truth I had been carrying quietly for years. They might not toast to me, but I was the one holding the strings they never noticed. It wasn't always like this, or maybe it was, and I had just been too naive to name it when I was younger. I could recall birthdays where my cake seemed smaller, graduations where their applause for me had been half-hearted compared to the standing ovation for her, and even hospital rooms where my recovery was treated like an inconvenience compared to her sniffles being elevated to a family crisis. Still, that night, the performance of it all felt especially cruel. They could have nodded at me, they could have included me with a polite line, but instead they leaned into the absence, letting the silence press me down like I didn't exist. As I rinsed the dishes, I thought about how families like to tell themselves that favoritism is unintentional, that parents don't realize the damage they inflict when they measure their children against each other. But my parents weren't clumsy, they were deliberate. They enjoyed the performance of building my sister up, the theater of choosing her as their golden child, because it gave them something to talk about with their friends. My achievements, my stability, my independence, none of it gave them the same shine, because it didn't fit their script. I had learned long ago not to compete for their spotlight, but what they didn't realize was that stepping out of it had given me power they never accounted for. When I stepped back onto the patio with clean glasses, my sister flashed me that smug little smile that I knew too well, the one that said she had won again. She didn't need to speak it aloud. It was in the way she tilted her chin, in the way she looped her arm through her fiancé's and looked around as if daring anyone to challenge her position. I kept my expression flat, almost bored, as though none of this touched me, but inside I was taking notes the way I always did. She might have been their star, but she leaned on me in ways she would never admit, not to them, not even to herself. And while they toasted her career, her engagement, her so-called brilliance, I was the one keeping the paperwork straight, the bills aligned, and the quiet safety nets intact. Dinner carried on as if I weren't there. My father told the same story about how my sister had saved her department at work, leaving out the fact that I had been the one helping her polish those reports late at night when she had panicked. My mother beamed proudly, nodding so hard her earrings shook, while I silently gathered the trash and tucked it away, invisible as always. The neighbors left, the plates emptied, and my parents leaned back in their chairs with contentment painted across their faces, unaware that the person they erased had already decided she would no longer play along with their charade. When the night wound down, I slipped back inside before the last toast could ring out. In the quiet of the kitchen, I dried my hands on a towel and stared at my phone resting on the counter. I didn't need to check the messages yet. I already knew the script would soon flip. My sister's pedestal was only as stable as the foundation I had built for her, and I had grown tired of watching her dance on it while pretending I was merely the stagehand. By the time everyone said their goodnights, I had already crafted my plan without a single word leaving my mouth. They thought silence meant surrender, but silence has teeth if you know how to use it. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and let the muffled sound of their laughter outside fade into the background. What none of them realized was that I had stopped being the forgotten one a long time ago. I had simply been waiting for the right moment to let them feel the weight of what they had taken for granted. And as I sat there, my phone buzzed faintly, a small preview of the unraveling to come. The funny thing about being treated like furniture is that you have time to observe the room, and while everyone else is busy posing for invisible cameras, you can map the wiring behind the walls. The little switches that make lights flicker or make the whole place go dark, which is how I ended up being the one who handled the boring but essential things that my sister could never be bothered with, like health insurance renewals, tuition-related forms for her additional certification, and the automatic transfers that paid off the balances she carried like fashion accessories. She liked to say that she was a big-picture person and that I had a talent for details, which sounded flattering if you didn't notice that the big picture only stood upright because someone had leveled the frame and tightened the screws behind it. On Monday morning, when the smoke of the barbecue had finally lifted and the house smelled like coffee instead of charred marinade, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of envelopes, my laptop, and a quietly simmering resolve that tasted almost sweet. Because there is a special flavor to the moment you stop trying to be the good daughter and start being the adult who keeps her own oxygen mask secure first. And if that sounds cold, then maybe you've never spent years being told that your calm was ingratitude and your reliability was plainness. I opened the portal for our family billing account, the one my parents never learned to navigate and my sister always forgot to update, and I scrolled through the list of recurring payments that chugged along every month like obedient little trains. Each line a reminder of a favor I had agreed to during some past crisis, where she was too overwhelmed to learn how passwords work. The travel card with points she liked to boast about at dinner was fed by an autopay I had set up. The clinic membership that secured quick appointments was tethered to my profile, and the tuition plan for her evening classes was bundled with our parent policy only because I knew which box to tick when the system kept throwing errors. I am not a villain, although it would be easier to label me one and be done with it, and I am not a saint. Because saints do not check the terms and conditions and quietly note that a service will lapse on its own if the primary contact is removed 30 days before the renewal date. I am a woman who has learned, through many small humiliations, that boundaries rarely arrive with trumpets, but instead with a mildly inconvenient email that says a setting has been changed. So I drafted a simple, polite message to the provider about consolidating accounts. I updated my information to reflect that I would no longer be managing anyone else's preferences. And I clicked the kind of button that does not make noise but echoes anyway, because you feel it in your ribs like a door finally closing. The change was neither dramatic nor cruel. It was the bureaucratic version of telling someone to carry their own suitcase. And while that might sound petty, ask anyone who has hauled luggage across a crowded terminal for a grown adult who never once said thank you. By lunchtime, my phone buzzed with the bland punctuation marks of modern life, a notification from the tuition portal requesting confirmation from the new primary contact, a notice from the clinic asking for a fresh card on file, and a cheerful email from the rewards program reminding the account holder to review their payment method to avoid interruption of benefits. None of these messages said my name, and that felt right, because this was not a performance. It was administrative hygiene. Though I will admit there was a ribbon of satisfaction running through it, the way you feel when you finally clean a drawer that has been catching on its rails for years, and it slides smoothly at last. In the afternoon, my mother called to ask whether I could drive over and help her figure out a recipe conversion for a charity potluck. A request that used to make me feel included, but now sounded like another small enlistment in a war I had not agreed to fight, and I told her gently that I was swamped with work, which was not entirely true, but not a lie either. Because emotional labor is work and I had an overflowing inbox of it, she sighed in that theatrical way that suggests disappointment, without assigning blame, and then she pivoted to her usual chorus about my sister's busy schedule and remarkable commitments, which I let wash over me like the elevator music of our family. Near evening, my sister texted a photo of a new blazer with a caption about a big presentation, followed by a casual "love you" that read less like affection and more like a preemptive receipt for favors yet to be delivered. And I responded with a quick thumbs up in words, because I have learned that silence breeds interpretations while simple acknowledgments keep the peace, though peace was no longer the endgame. I opened my laptop again, checked the audit trail for the account updates, and made sure the confirmations had gone to the right inboxes, not mine, which felt like setting birds free from a cage that I had been feeding at my own expense. I poured tea, sat by the window where the last light turned the street into a ribbon of copper, and I allowed myself to replay the barbecue toast like surveillance footage, not to hurt myself but to keep the facts straight. Because memory in families like ours is a competitive sport and I preferred documentation, I thought of the way my father's voice had swelled when he praised her courage, and the way my mother had wiped imaginary tears while scanning the crowd for witnesses. And I realized that what they wanted from me was the quiet continuation of services, not a daughter with feelings, which made my next decision surprisingly easy. Before bed, I logged into the shared cloud folder where, for years, I had been the unnamed assistant uploading scanned receipts, appointment notes, and updated ID cards, and I organized everything into two clean directories labeled with dates and neutral tags. Then I set a timed transfer to hand the folder ownership back to its rightful recipient. The system asked if I was sure, and I was, not because I wanted anyone to suffer, but because I wanted everyone to notice the weight of what they expected me to carry forever. When the transfer confirmation appeared, a final line of text asked whether I wanted to send a message to notify the new owner, and I typed a single sentence that was as polite as a handshake and as sharp as a boundary, wishing her luck with the presentation and reminding her that any future updates would need her direct approval since I would no longer be managing access. And I hit send with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has finally put her name on the life she maintains. By the middle of the week, when the calendar squares had already blurred together and the city felt like it was running on stale coffee and recycled air, the first quiet tremors rolled through the carefully staged landscape my parents loved to admire. And they arrived not as spectacle, but as a sequence of politely phrased prompts that would mean nothing to people who never lift the hood, a tuition system requesting new verification from the primary contact, a clinic portal flagging a missing consent form for non-patient coordination, a travel rewards program suggesting the account holder update the billing profile to avoid service interruption. Each message delivered with the same bright tone a flight attendant uses while buckling into severe turbulence, because she knows panic is contagious. I made tea, opened each notification like I was listening to a suspicious rattle under a car, and reminded myself that I had not sabotaged anything. I had simply stepped out of a job I was never paid to do, which, in a household that treats unpaid labor as affection, feels like treason even when it is merely adulthood with boundaries and a backbone. My sister called during her lunch break from a cafeteria that hummed with the restless chatter of people who eat standing up, and she launched into a monologue so fast it sounded like someone pressed play on a podcast at double speed, asking whether I had received a weird email about her evening class because the system suddenly wanted her to verify identity and provide a card, which was strange, she said, because it had always just worked the way the dishwasher just works until a person notices someone has been scraping the plates first, and I let her talk until she ran out of runway. I told her, slowly and clearly, that the accounts were now hers to manage since she is a competent adult with a presentation coming up and a fiancé who loves to brag about her leadership, and that while I wished her every success, I was no longer the person who babysat password resets, permission toggles, and paper trails because doing so had turned me into a ghost who lived in the margins of everyone else's life. She went quiet with that startled little gasp people use when their free concierge service posts a close sign, and then she tried humor, telling me I was being dramatic, which was funny coming from someone who throws confetti for finishing a spreadsheet. In the afternoon, my mother called with the lilting concern of a woman who has discovered the thermostat no longer moves when she taps the glass, and she asked, far too casually, whether I had changed something in the online things. which is her umbrella term for everything she refuses to learn, and I described the most neutral version of events I could manage, explaining that I had consolidated my personal information, returned ownership of documents, and removed myself from responsibilities that should never have been invisible in the first place, and I did it with the warmth of a person handing back a purse someone left behind at a party. She made a wounded sound that landed squarely between guilt and performance, then said the family should help each other, because that is what family is for. A statement that would have felt generous if it had ever included me as a beneficiary rather than a utility, and I said I agreed completely, which is why I trusted my sister to manage her own affairs like the brilliant adult they kept telling me she was. That evening, while the streetlight outside my window flickered like a tired eyelid and the apartment building across the way sang its nightly chorus of televisions and microwaves, the big presentation arrived for my sister. And with it the first consequences that did not look like consequences so much as friction. The rideshare card that always cleared with a cheerful chime suddenly requested another method, which sent her back upstairs to grab a different wallet while the clock glared at her. With the confidence of a referee, the conference room check-in system asked for an insurance card to pre-clear access to the on-site clinic that provides presenters with quick assistance for stress migraines, a perk she regularly used as a pre-game ritual. And when she tried to pull up the digital file, the portal politely suggested the account holder update permissions. She texted me a string of messages dressed as jokes. Look at this silly system. Look at this tech mess. Look at this ridiculous checklist, each one a balloon trying to lift a brick, and I responded with the kind of practical clarity that sounds like cruelty only to people who never had to learn it the hard way, telling her that everything she needed was in the folder now under her name, and that the clinic would be happy to help once she, the patient, provided consent and a valid card. To my own surprise, I did not feel triumphant watching her spin, because victory implies an opponent and I had stopped playing their game. Instead, I felt the grave steadiness of a person finally letting gravity act on objects that had been floating at her expense, and if there was any sweetness it came from the knowledge that I had not lied, schemed, or broken anything. No. I had simply turned the lights on and asked the room to walk without me carrying them. Still, I allowed myself a small flourish, because revenge can be both ethical and elegant. I updated the emergency contact information the clinic held for her from my number to our parents, a perfectly reasonable correction that aligned paperwork with reality, and then I scheduled an auto-reply on my phone for her calls that said, in friendly language, that I was unavailable for administrative support during business hours and that urgent matters should go to the appropriate provider or guardian. On file. When the presentation ended successfully, I later learned, because my sister is competent even when the training wheels come off, she sent me a selfie in the restroom mirror with eyes shining and a caption pretending to be breezy, but thrumming with accusation, asking whether I had changed something that made the clinic receptionist act weird, and whether I could just fix it tonight so she could stop thinking about it, and I stared at that photo for a long moment, not because I doubted my choice, but because old habits die very slowly when they are braided into loyalty, and then I typed a response that was neither cruel nor kind, but exactly correct, telling her that everything was set up for her to handle directly, and that if anyone had questions they should reach out to the primary contact, which, as of that afternoon, was our mother. By Thursday, the little administrative earthquakes I had triggered with ordinary keystrokes began to accumulate into a kind of domestic weather system that no one could pretend was a passing cloud. And it announced itself not through shouting or slammed doors, but through the oddly formal tone of institutions knocking on the right doors for once. Because when the clinic called to confirm that the new primary contact understood the policy around non-patient coordination and the responsibilities tied to being the emergency number, the call went to my mother's phone where it should have gone years ago, and her voice, usually syrupy and sure when describing my sister's excellence to any captive audience, came out thin as she repeated the receptionist's phrases as if tasting a language she had long outsourced to me, which is how I knew the handoff had landed exactly where it belonged. I was not cruel on that call. I simply said that the clinic would walk her through the process, that it was standard to require the patient's consent for access, and that it made sense for the patient and her chosen contact to manage their own arrangements. A sentence that did not carry any heat in my mouth even though I knew it would feel like ice in hers. In the afternoon, a second thread unspooled when the bursar's office emailed to say that the tuition plan sitting under our parents' policy had a missing signature now that ownership had been corrected, and because I had always smoothed these seams. No one in the house remembered that signatures are not metaphors and that deadlines do not bend around family stories, so my sister forwarded me the message with a string of soft pleasantries pretending not to be commands, asking whether I could just handle this like usual, since I knew the system, and I took a breath long enough to let the old muscle memory twitch and then go still, after which I replied that the portal conveniently offered a step-by-step wizard even for busy geniuses and that, for any policy questions, the insurer would be delighted to explain options directly to the policyholder, a phrasing that made her type back the 3 dots of simmering irritation without giving them the dignity of actual words. My father entered the picture just before dinner with the righteousness of a man who has been interrupted during the best part of a game, asking what on earth had changed and why my mother was suddenly on the phone juggling forms like a temp worker, and I told him, in a tone so level you could have built a shelf on it, that nothing had broken, that the systems were operating exactly as designed, and that the only novelty here was the absence of a silent middleman who never received credit or even a plate at the table. Since justice, for me, had always looked like accuracy rather than spectacle, I allowed myself one additional adjustment that felt less like a strike and more like a small correction of the map, and I opened the shared family calendar where, for years, I had been the one to color-code appointments, flag insurance renewal windows, and nudge relatives about potluck sign-ups that my mother would later claim as her tireless organizing, and I changed the owner to my sister, attached a sunny little note that the calendar had been updated to reflect grown-up autonomy, and unsubscribed with a single click that removed the buzzing hive from my pocket. Then, in a separate window, I exported a neat packet of PDFs from the archive folder. Insurance cards, appointment histories, the very spreadsheet she once joked made me look like an accountant, and dropped them into a new directory named with her initials and the current year, a handoff as polite as an engraved tray being set in front of a person who had always assumed the table replenished itself by magic. None of this was vindictive, although it would certainly be labeled that later. It was the administrative equivalent of returning borrowed clothes washed, folded, and placed on a bed with a note that says they will hang better if the owner is the one who keeps them hung. My aunt, who has always functioned as the family's unofficial seismograph for trouble, texted at dusk to ask whether something had happened, because my mother had sounded off and had used the phrase "someone pulled a plug" in a tone usually reserved for power outages and moral declines, and I told her the truth wrapped in velvet, saying that I had cleared my name off a set of favors that had long been mistaken for obligations and that, although the transition would be bumpy, everyone involved was fully capable, even gifted, and would certainly manage once they were in contact with the right offices. She replied with a wry line about how competence is never as flattering as helplessness in some households. And for the first time that week I laughed without bitterness, a short surprise sound that felt like a glass unclenching in warm water. After 9, while I washed dishes in the soft light my landlord insists on calling energy efficient, my phone began to strobe with notifications that stacked so quickly they looked like the readout of a slot machine, a chorus of group messages and back-channel pleas, and the distinctive ring of my sister's number, and I let them pile up until the sink was clean and my breathing had settled, because I wanted to meet whatever came next with a mind as quiet as a winter lake. When I finally picked up her call, she did not bother with a greeting. She went straight to a whisper shout about mother having cried in the pantry and father snapping at the dog and the clinic acting weird and the school being annoying and why, exactly, had I chosen this week to make everything complicated when she had real goals and a full plate and a network to maintain, and I listened until her demands collapsed into questions and her questions softened into uncertainty, and then I said the single most honest sentence I could offer, which is that I had not made anything complicated. I had simply stopped simplifying life for people who did not see me. and that if Mother was crying it might be because she was finally meeting the engine she had been praising from the hood. There was a long rustling silence, the kind that reveals who is breathing and who is listening, and then my screen lit with a message that would set the next hours humming like a wire. Mom's crying nonstop. Why? When the message from my sister arrived, the one with the sharp edges disguised as worry, telling me that our mother was crying nonstop and demanding to know why, I stared at it for so long the phone screen dimmed in my hand. And in that dimness I felt the years stretch backward into every moment where my silence had been read as agreement, every gathering where my labor had been mistaken for loyalty, and every compliment withheld until my existence could be reframed as a comparison to someone else's shine. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, poured myself a drink, and allowed the ice to clink against the glass like punctuation, because if I was going to answer her, it would not be from the place of the forgotten daughter groveling for recognition, but from the vantage of the woman who had finally stopped mistaking service for love. The truth, though, is rarely a clean weapon you can unsheath and swing in a single arc. It is a net, tangled with years of choices, excuses, and half-truths, and if you cast it too fast you risk dragging yourself under along with the fish. I knew that if I told her outright that our mother was crying because the scaffolding had been yanked away, because the quiet figure in the background had put down her load, the words would be dismissed as cruelty, another attempt to paint myself as the victim, and the family would rush to patch the story with tape and denial until it held again. I also knew that saying nothing would let the mythology continue unbroken, allowing them to pretend the tears were simply exhaustion or hormonal tides or stress from the charity bake sale, and while that option was tempting in its simplicity, it meant I would have handed back the silence they had always used against me. So I crafted something else, something slippery and deliberate, reply that looked like generosity but carried the echo of accusation, and I typed slowly, letting each word weigh itself on my tongue before I allowed it to leave my hand. I wrote that I hoped Mom would be all right, that sometimes people cry when they finally feel the weight of things they've ignored, and that perhaps it was time everyone considered whether the balance of responsibilities in our family had been as fair as they liked to pretend. I hit send, and I knew immediately that the sentence would live like a splinter in their conversations, small enough to be denied, but sharp enough to sting every time they tried to grip the old narrative. The silence after my message was almost luxurious, the kind of quiet that expands across a room like heavy curtains drawn at midday, and in that silence I realized that my revenge had never been about wreckage or humiliation, but about exposure. About forcing the people who had thrived in the comfort of my invisibility to see what life felt like when the invisible hands withdrew. It was not the fireworks of a screaming match or the satisfaction of slammed doors. It was the subtler, steadier triumph of watching a machine sputter when the unnoticed cog is finally removed. If my mother wept, it was not because I had destroyed her, but because she had built her sense of control on something she refused to acknowledge, and the absence of that denial had left her bare. In the following days, messages trickled in from relatives who had caught fragments of the drama, asking in their own careful ways whether I was doing all right, though their curiosity was really about our mother. As if her tears carried more narrative weight than my years of silence, and I responded politely with lines that neither confirmed nor denied anything, which left them unsettled but respectful, because nothing disturbs people more than a refusal to play the expected role. My sister, for her part, shifted into a strange register of half apologies and thin justifications, explaining that she had never meant to dump so much on me, that she was only following the path laid out for her, that she admired my strength. As if admiration could erase the years of being treated like the scaffolding behind her stage. I replied with civility, even warmth, but never with absolution, because absolution is a gift you give when someone has truly asked for it, and she had not. I kept thinking back to that barbecue, to the clinking glasses raised high while I carried plates inside, and I wondered whether any of them had yet realized that the quiet figure moving in the background had chosen that moment to begin the undoing. Not with shouting or grand gestures, but with the patient, calculated hand of someone who understands exactly which wires to pull. Perhaps my mother cried because she saw, for the first time, how precarious her little hierarchy had been, Perhaps she cried because she realized that the daughter she had overlooked had never been weak at all, but had been keeping the whole fragile structure upright. Or perhaps she cried simply because she knew the old pattern would not return, that even if I relented and resumed a fraction of my former duties, I would never again be the same kind of ghost she could praise in absence while feeding on my presence. Late one night, when the phone buzzed again with a muted plea from my sister, I looked at the glowing screen and then at my own reflection in the dark window, and I felt a calm so complete it was almost frightening. Because I understood that the true revenge had already taken place. They had toasted her while pretending I was not there, and I had answered not with a protest, but with the quiet withdrawal that turned their celebration into a hollow echo. The tears, the panic, the unraveling, all of it was simply the natural sound of a house that had finally realized one of its pillars had walked away. And so, instead of replying, I set the phone face down, let the unanswered message sink into the dark like a stone tossed into water, and I finished my drink in silence, not triumphant, not defeated, but certain that for the first time in years, they were the ones awake at night wondering what I might do next, while I, for once, slept without dreams.